Hi folks, we're Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of British steel, which has been, as I understand it, at least, renationalised or partially nationalised by the government, the federal government. So the government now owns British Steel. Now we'll go through the sort of the ebbs and flows of what's happened to British steel manufacturing over the last 100 years or so. But I also wanted to talk about the difference between a company that is, or a business or a sector of the industry that's been nationalised, that is owned by the government, or one that goes from being nationalised to being privatised, or just it was a straight out private business all along. And then talking about other factors like market competition and so on and so forth. Now, Britain was the Industrial Revolution began in Britain, and steel manufacturing in Britain was very much a part of that, laying all those railway tracks, all those steel hull ships and all this sort of thing. So the steel industry in Britain was, relative to the rest of the world at the time, was huge. Now, by the sort of 1860s, 70s, the rest of the world was catching up. And by the 1890s, the United States and Germany in particular had overtaken Britain, not only in the quantity of steel produced, but also the quality of that steel, and also in the precision engineering, micron type level, precision engineering of steel and so on. So Britain was already falling behind in the late 1890s. And was decidedly falling behind, 10, 15, 20 years later. You could see this in World War I, where the Germans could interchange any part on any field gun, the heavy cannons and so on, whereas the British, if a field gun was manufactured in one factory, because it was almost like well split up cottage industries, if it was, it would be a few microns different in the machining of the part or the component in a different factory. So the parts were very often, not always, you couldn't interchange them because they just weren't made to the exact same spec. The gauges and measuring tools were just a few microns off, and that meant that they could, from factory to factory, which meant that they couldn't be interchanged, whereas the Germans had rigorous quality standards. And this ended up making a huge difference, that they could do field repairs on cannons and have them back in service in a matter of hours or even minutes in some cases, whereas the British had to order another part from that factory for that gun, which meant that it was out of operation for sometimes weeks, if not months at a time. But coming to the general issue, the British steel industry was private, although they relied heavily on government orders for certain things. They were still a private industry, and it was quite diverse. There wasn't just one steel manufacturing plant; there were a number, and some may have an emphasis on armaments and munitions. Others may make focus more heavily on making railway tracks, things like that. So, but nonetheless, there was not just one blast furnace, but many, and it was to some degree at least, a pretty competitive industry. Now, the entry level cost into setting up a full steel mill with all the blast furnaces and all the bits and pieces, it's not a cheap undertaking, particularly today, given the sort of technology. So you can't just conjure up new entrants into the market, just suddenly appear and they create extra competition in the market, which drives prices down and pushes efficiencies up. Now, after World War II in Britain, the government, the Labour government, the leftist Labour government, to some degree ideological, but also for other reasons, they decided to nationalise the steel industry and other industries. But their sort of the general rule of thumb was that if an industry was a near monopoly or oligopoly, then it wasn't a competitive industry. People weren't benefiting from the lower prices a competitive sector of the economy will be offering. There was just a few people getting very rich out of the monopoly situation of say, steel production, other things too, like railways and the like. So the government thought, well, what we'll do is we'll take over. The government will take over. So the people will own the steel manufacturing plants. Now they were kind of missing the point that just because you got a few sort of fat cats getting even richer doesn't mean that they're not delivering other benefits such as jobs and providing, product that the economy needs. They're also doing things that are needed. Whether or not they're getting rich, you could debate that. Well, we don't want any fat. If we can stop those fat cats from getting rich, then we've accomplished something really big. No, that's an ideological determination. It's not particularly helpful in the overall scheme of things. So when when the British government sort of nationalised steel, they wanted to create economies of scale. So if there were smaller steel manufacturers around in little niche areas, they wanted to sort of close all that down and have one big steel manufacturing sort of organisation that manufacture, and this would then create economies of scale. And this is very much something, the lessons that the Americans had supposedly taught the rest of the world during the World War II manufacturing boom in the United States was you must create economies of scale. You must have a certain critical mass of manufacturing and of industrial machines and that sort of thing, and then that in itself creates efficiencies in as much as you have achieved this critical mass in any given industry sector, which could be steel or manufacturing cars or anything, mass chemical production. The Germans too so now the British industry was more. I mean, there wasn't that there weren't big businesses, international businesses. Britain there were, but there was still a lot of cottage industry, what today we would see as cottage industry, smaller little players in little niche areas. So anyway, the idea was to combine all that in. Now, that's a fair enough thing, by the way. There's nothing wrong with that. Economy of scale. You don't have small little groups sort of competing with each other over small niche areas. And this was the view at the time. Now, these small niche areas, these people had very specific area expertise. And a lot of that was lost when they tried to bring it all. I'm simplifying the explanation here, by the way. Well, a lot of that was lost, that very specific niche expertise, whether it be in steel or other manufacturing areas. The obsession was to create economies of scale and big organizations. Now, the argument that sort of a part of the other argument was, well, look, it's a monopoly, sure, and monopolies, if they're owned by the private sector, they screw the people because they're monopolies and they can just increase prices and screw the employees and screw the consumer and that sort of thing. But if the government owns it, we're benevolent, we're loving, we're kind, we're generous. We're not going to screw the consumer, and so the government owns it, and again, their ideological view as well. I'm not like those fat cats. We're not going to screw the people, and that's fine as an ideology. But is it realistic in the real world of finance and economics and delivering goods and services and so on and so forth? So now politicians, the government owns, the people own it, but really the politicians own it. They push the buttons, pull the levers, pull the strings, and so on. So let's say unemployment is getting a little bit out of control in an area where the steel mill is, or one of the plants, or the whatever. The government then comes a lot of pressure politically to say, go to the steel mill and say, listen, unemployment's getting pretty bad around there. We want you to employ 2,000 people. Now, the managers of the mill may say, well, gee, there's no jobs for 2,000 people. Doesn't matter. Just do it. Just fucking do it. Now, all the executive jobs in the steel business, that steel manufacturing conglomerate, all those jobs are handed out by politicians. So if anyone sort of says, no, look, we can't employ 2,000 people, it'll make the steel mill unprofitable, or it'll make standards will fall, or it'll create industrial problems, then that person's going to be out of a job. Now, if you're a flunky and a parasite with government connections, you're probably not capable of getting a job in the real world, and you've now got a very well-paid, prestigious job. So the politicians lean on you and employ an extra few thousand people in the area. Then fuck, if that's what you want, fine. they still keep their job, and they've still got their, all that international travel and living in that nice house. They would lose some of that if all of it, if they resisted or defied the political machinations of their government masters. So they employ another couple of thousand people. Now the trade unions then go to the government and say, listen, our members need more money and need more benefits and need this, need that, and so on. So then there's industrial issues. More ground is conceded, more costs are incurred that don't need to be. It's nothing to do with the amount of steel produced or the quality of it. So whereas at one time, and I'll just use round numbers here, it cost $100 a ton to make the steel. Now it's because of all these extra people they're employing, and so it's $200 a ton. Now on top of that, the really well connected people in the socialite circles, they go to their political friends, their buddies in the government, and say, look, I'd like a job at that nice steel conglomerate there. What about a consultant on, say, $1 million a year? I've got a big mortgage to pay, and I've got kids to put through school. We've known each other since high school. Can you fix me? Yeah, sure, Billy Bob. I'll have a word to the folks there at the steel. So before you know it, there are armies of consultants and shadowy figures, all being paid big bucks, all parasiting, all like termites eating away the foundations of the whole thing. These parasites that are getting paid serious money, some of them richly paid. The going rate for in a government quango or some sort of nationalised industry, the going rate in Australia 25 years ago was $400,000 a year. So imagine what it is today. So the costs of the business go out of control. Now, more and more people are being added to the managerial ranks that have no expertise in business, they have no expertise in steel, they have no expertise in manufacturing, and they're just sort of puppet conduit type flunkies for making sure that the political will of the whim of the politicians of the day is being expressed in the organisation. And continually their demands, can you hire more people, to reduce unemployment in a given area or whatever. Look, can you hire more women? But there are no jobs. It doesn't matter. Just create them, invent them, for fuck's sake. Just do what we're telling you to do. You want to keep your cozy job or not? And so all these things are added in, and so it becomes hopelessly inefficient. So what in the private sector they could make steel for $100 a ton is now at $300 a ton, because the whole area has been politicized. It's no longer a business or an efficient business, or they're trying to efficiently produce steel, quality steel. It's not that anymore. It's just an extension of the wider, political miasma, and it's just been absorbed into that political machine. And for a politician, this can be, the unemployment is high in their area, and then suddenly unemployment's down to next to nothing because they've just heavied the steel guys to hire thousands of people. Problem solved. As far as they're concerned, it's a problem solved. Now, whereas they solved the problem of the minute, getting themselves re-elected, it's now created an ongoing problem which will destroy the industry. So it gets to the point where the government has to, using taxpayer money, by the way, has to bail out, because they've got expenses of $100, but they're only getting revenue of $50 from selling the steel. So somewhere they've got to find that $50 to make a difference. And of course, the taxpayer is paying it. It's a nationalized government-owned industry. So the taxpayer is paying that difference. And we can see that mentality, by the way, in the way USAID in the United States disgorges money. It's to make up the difference between, and pay the difference, and underwrite and fund the difference between efficiency and inefficiency, and the politicization of a process. And this is what happened with British Steel and other areas of manufacturing. Motor vehicle manufacturing is pretty much the same thing. The government had nationalized so many industries that they treated it all as just an extension of the wider political process, rather than businesses that they wanted to make efficient and deliver efficient outcomes for the people. And so it was always the taxpayer that was bailing out these industries. Then they decided to go and privatise these industries in the period of Margaret Thatcher's prime ministership in particular. And so British Steel was then privatised. They had a previous attempt to privatise it that sort of didn't really work out so well, but it privatised. Now they just handed the whole steel thing into the hands of international finance that were using tax avoidance, offsetting, and all sorts of things. Now, could they produce steel more efficiently? Well, they could, and they cut back on the payrolls and they clamped down on industrial sort of activity and so on and so forth. But it didn't mean the business was necessarily profitable. It was, again, owned by a small cohort of international financiers that their sole purpose wasn't to deliver steel and quality and efficiently. It was to enrich themselves. So again, it actually failed in its purpose of being a viable business, and relied heavily on government protection, relied heavily on the inability of other competitors to enter the market, and so on and so forth. So then it was in effect renationalised, or allowed them to be sold to then offshore, including like a Chinese company buying British Steel. I mean, give me a fucking break, seriously. The pioneers of mass steel manufacturing in the modern era were suddenly selling out to the Chinese. Man, what a joke. And then that fell over as well. The high cost of energy, the Green New Deal and all that sort of stuff. And so now they're looking at renationalising. But I just wanted to sort of cover those issues that Britain is now, unless the government nationalises steel manufacturing, could be on the cusp of not having a raw steel manufacturing industry. That doesn't mean they won't have steel, say, steel recycling, for example. That's still there. So it won't be as if there's no steel at all. But the idea of sort of getting the iron ore and the coal and turning that into quality steel, that runs a real possibility now that for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, Britain won't make raw steel at all, and that's an astonishing development. What's particularly irritating to me is it's so unnecessary. I mean, quite apart from the Green New Deal thing, the incompetence, the ineptitude, the silliness, the political harry-carry, the whole thing has just been, they've lurched from one incompetent, ridiculous episode to the next, and look at the outcome. At no point has anyone sort of that I can see, and if this has happened, then these people have been ignored. No one said, okay, what must we do to have an efficient steel industry in this country? That sort of thing. And it's fairly, once you say, well, that's the path we're going to go down, then a lot of things start to fall into place, and the decisions you make become relevant to that objective. That doesn't look like it's been done, or again, if it at all happened, it was ignored or waved away. Isn't this incredible that the country that invented the Industrial Revolution and steel manufacturing is now on the verge of producing no steel? I mean, it's insane. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.